So Repertory Theater, and I am the co-vice president of the TCG board. And I think thank you so much. After hearing our panelists this morning, I think the thing that TCG is really committed to the success of this conversation about capitalization. So we've decided to distribute bags of cash to you after you exit the building today. Just make sure, though, when you leave the Wall Street area, you leave quickly and quietly. It's my pleasure to introduce our next panel, which will be focused on 3 case studies connected to capitalization. We're hoping that the experiences shared by these 3 different theaters will deepen our dialogue in the breakout sessions afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Steve Martin, the Managing Director of Child's Play, Erica Malin, the Executive Director of the Signature Theater Company, David Hawkinson, the Executive Director of Steppenwolf Theater, and our moderator, Teresa Iron.
Thanks for arranging the bags of cash. Very nice of you. I want to thank Janet Brown from Brand Makers in the Arts and Susan Nelson and Rebecca Thomas again for the presentation. I've seen it now, the full presentation twice, and I've been blown away both times. And really, I think Janet mentioned that this is the first time that the presentation has been given to such a large national group of theater practitioners and trustees. Grant makers are seeing the presentation on a fairly regular basis at this point, so they're being informed as well. But we're really grateful for our partnership with GIA and glad that we could bring the presentation to you today. One of the things I wanted to mention, Susan talked about how because of the importance of local market conditions, as something that impacts and drives results within organizations, that local data really needed to be kind of king when thinking about your own organizations. And I just want to mention that another plug for the fiscal survey that TCG does is that if you complete the survey, you have access to running reports of all different kinds, including looking at local and regional data. So if you want to compare yourselves against theaters that are in your locality or region, that's a good way to do it. Fill out the survey, and then you can look at those results. As Bob mentioned, we're going to hear now from Erica Malin, who is the Executive Director of Signature Theater, Steve Martin, Managing Director of Child's Play, and David Hawkinson from Steppenwolf. We wanted everyone to have a chance, after hearing that great presentation, to be able to hear how that kind of thinking might be applied in 3 different organizations with different kinds of financial structures and challenges. So we're going to hear from them now, and we're going to start with Erica Malin, Executive Director of Signature Theater.
So I have to apologize first. I was not here this morning, and I'm struggling against a cold. So probably what I'll say may be heresy compared to what was said this morning, but hopefully it won't be. But I'm also really honored that Teresa asked Signature to speak today and tell our story about capitalization within a capital project. And as many of you know, the Signature story was a lot about careful planning, transition and reserve funding, financing, but also being in the wrong place at the right time, and then later on being in the right place at the wrong time. So there's a lot to that story. But again, I think in terms of capitalization, and I think I struggled with this a lot because I think capitalization means different things to different people, as you'll hear from us and as I'm sure you've been talking about. But in our case, again, it was based on 3 pillars, I would say, which is a business model that was essentially a decade in the making, a transition and reserve funding plan, and then straight old-fashioned financing, which was more of a short-term strategy during the campaign. So to put this all in context, I'll just briefly go over Signature's history because it does sort of push the narrative forward. We were founded in 1991 by our artistic director, Jim Houghton. Our mission is a very clear one. We are devoted to the playwright. We explore a playwright's work over a course of a season, much in the way that you would go to a museum and look at a retrospective of an artist's work. We did that as our first few seasons. 10 years into our history, we added programming, which is now called the Legacy Program, where we bring writers back to experience their signature and premiere works. And in this way, we have a dialogue with the audience and the writer throughout a period of time, and essentially a conversation that goes on. And that is the heart and soul of our mission. After we started the Legacy Program, I think there was real thought as to what was going to be next for Signature. We had started at a little black box downtown at the Campo Center. We were now in the Peter Norton space, 160-seat theater on 42nd between 10th and 11th, which at that time was essentially no man's land, and is no longer that. And, you know, fixed amount of seats. We're doing 3 to 4 productions. What's next for Signature? And we began to do that horrible, terrible thing that everyone hates to do, which is, you know, looking within an institution, either in the form of a strategic plan or a vision. And we, you know, started to think about a business model, feasibility studies, branding, all that stuff that is, I will say, excruciatingly painful for me, but is absolutely a worthy endeavor for every institution. And that was powered by the desire to further the artistic mission. And I think what you will hear from me and from everyone who will speak here is that that always is the driving force behind whatever what you're doing, and you're capitalizing to support that mission no matter what. So what was next? And we wanted to add a third program. That's great, terrific. We wanted to have a third program where it said, we want writers at all different periods of your career. We want you to have a home. We want to stop the cycle of readings and workshops. We want to guarantee you 3 productions. We want to give you a stipend and health insurance. And so with this idea then came with a lot of thought and you know, push and pull, the idea of 3 programs and 3 spaces, where these ideas, people, artists, back of house, everything could collide in these orchestrated collisions of art. And in that mix would be the audience as well, so that there was, again, continuing our intimate conversation with them. Okay, so that's great. We're in a 160-seat house. There's like only a certain amount of days in the year to actually put on this programming, and there's a certain amount of fixed seats. At the same time, as we're thinking about this program in the future, we're also thinking about how to grow our audience. And in 2005, we started the Signature Ticket Initiative, which is our subsidy program. This became part of our belief system. We, Signature, believe that the biggest barrier to theater going is price. And so how did we attack that? We said we want to provide a subsidized ticket. It gets, you know, we have to fundraise for it. It's supported by foundations and individuals, and started out with a $15 ticket for every seat, every performance, during the initial run of our shows. So that was a hands-down success. Our doors were open. This was the, you know, one strategy in diversifying our audiences, old, young, people of color, and the added benefit of our donations started to increase. Because we increased our audience, and because there was a civic imperative attached to that program, people who could afford to pay were now donating, because when they got into the house and they sat down next to someone, they knew that they probably helped to have that someone sit there. And that was a very tactile moment for us, and also pushed us forward towards the growth and to further realizing where we could go. Okay, so that's good. We're still in a 160-seat house. We still really have no place to, you know, physically and within the calendar to really implement our vision. And along comes the World Trade Center site. So this is the wrong site and the right time. And what this site, however, forced Signature to do was to put that vision of these programs, particularly that third program, on paper. And not just on paper, but in a very detailed, and I mean really detailed, excruciatingly detailed business model. So in a business model, that means everything from cost per square foot of cleaning your facility to, you know, every single staff member you're going to have to employ, which will, I guarantee you, you know, double and triple, and a million different assumptions went into that business model, contingencies. We had every single staff member, every single artist who we worked with help weigh in on this business model for us to understand the costs and the needs it would take us to do a 3-theater, and 3-program operation. And this business model essentially became our Bible. And it comes to play later on as we get into the campaign. Put that aside for a second. We're embroiled in this World Trade Center site. But here's sort of another capitalization strategy. We built a very, very strong relationship with our city government. Now, whether it's a donor or a city government or state government, may not be the federal government, but this was a relationship that we worked very hard on. And it will pay off, as you will see later on down the road. So we're embroiled with them. The site downtown, the price tag for us, and Joyce was also selected as well, was a $700 million plus project. This was untenable. There's just no way to do it. And of course the politics embroiled down there were slowing the process down, and our lease was running out, which led us to another sort of moment of thought, because do we release and do it month by month, year by year, and pay up the nose? We don't own our space. Do we go into another long-term lease? Then we then have to be penalized for breaking. There was a lot of, that's when the gray hairs start to kind of come out. So the city, in our relationship, literally helped us look at various spaces. Lo and behold, 1 block east of us is a city, square, full city block that was affectionately known as Lake Related. It had been a site that was sitting fallow, that had old theaters on it that were torn down, and it was owned by the developer, the Related companies. And we were introduced to Related, and a match was made with the city. Now, often when that happens, when you're face-to-face with the developer or anyone else who has a lot more money and power and might than you do, the nonprofit is sort of at the lower chair and doesn't have the same seat at the table. I think our relationship to the city, plus the fact that we had clearly identified what our vision was, that we had identified in a business model what those costs looked like, and then the third thing that we could bring to the table, which gave so much comfort, was another pillar of capitalization for us, which was our transition and reserve funding plan. So when we did this business model, and you plug in all these numbers, lo and behold, there's a gap, as there always is. And this business model was, I think, it was about 7 years out from when we started. We did it for 7 years. And there was a gap, and it was cumulative, and it takes time to ramp up from one level of growth to another level of growth to another level of growth. So we took that gap. We also looked at what a reserve, at that time, it was an endowment, and that changed because endowments were out and not liquid enough. Then it became a quasi-endowment, and now it's a straight reserve, or designated, but straight reserve. But having that in pulling those numbers out from our operational Bible and putting them into our capital campaign showed huge credibility and thought in terms of, with the players that we were working with. It said, yeah, okay, let's build a building, you gotta raise all that money, bricks and mortar, blah, blah, blah. But you're actually showing us a little bit, you're giving us a peek of how you're gonna be sustainable in the future. Is that a stop? Oh my gosh, okay, I'm almost there. Not almost there, okay. At any rate, so transition to reserve funding, and a very detailed business model, and then straight on financing. These two things worked in our favor to essentially, when we got to the negotiating table with the developer to build our space, we were able to be at the level playing field. We were able to negotiate loan terms for a seed construction loan. We were able to negotiate a mortgage that actually does not kick in until we are 5 years into our center. I mean, terms that worked with our business model. And because we had that business model, we were able to be very flexible as to how we could turn on a dime, what we could and couldn't negotiate, what we couldn't handle, what debt we could take on, and what debt we couldn't. And those helped shape the projects, the capital campaign. And finally, we put all of this into our capital campaign, including our debt and including our financing costs. Because when we went to a donor, you said, yes, we want you to pay for bricks and mortar, but when you do contribute, you're not only paying for that, you're paying for transition, reserve, financing, so that we can survive this massive growth. So I'll wrap it up. 2012, we opened our doors to a 3-theater, 2 rehearsal space, cafe, bookstore, 70,000 square foot facility. In the first 15 months, we are able to put on 13 productions and host over 200,000 people in the center. So more gray hairs, but so I hope, I have to speed it up here at the end, but those were the sort of the major things that we employed to kind of get us there, remembering that the planning and the vision was decades, at least a decade in the making, and by having that tool of that business model, being able to be flexible with that, and plug numbers in and be able to negotiate at the same table, with the city, with the developer, and take care of our future for the next, 7 or 8 years, that's what made this campaign successful. But I will tell you now, guess what we're doing? We're planning for the next, 10 to 20 years right now, because that never really stops. But I'm stopping, okay? Thank you very much.
I'm Steve Martin. I'm the managing director at Child's Play. And in 2008, we had reached a very important milestone for our company. We moved into the $70 million Tempe Center for the Arts with 2 theaters. And we moved into our new Campus for Imagination and Wonder, a 40,000 square foot support facility with classrooms, rehearsal halls, administrative offices, etc. And when we did all this, we actually did it with $1 million endowment and about $500,000 in cash in the bank, and everything was rosy. And then in Arizona, the crash came, it came fast, and it came hard. And so when we were expecting things to kind of grow on our behalf, in fact, what we saw was disposable income disappear, families and children and school budgets and everything else come crashing to the ground. And so we experienced some enormous challenges for the next 2 years. During that time, our staff got together, we're an ensemble-based company, and came to us and said, we don't like the way we're growing, we don't like the way we're trying to produce theater anymore, we want to re-look at what we're doing, we want to re-embrace the idea of an ensemble company, and we want to change. Because we know that the model that we're currently operating under is not going to sustain us moving forward. And we charge $8 a ticket. From the get-go, it was an unsustainable business model. Anyway, so what we did was we did some internal and external examination. We hired Lisa Mount. A lot of you may know Lisa. She came in and worked with us for about a 2-year period in remodeling our business model. And what we recognized was that first and foremost, we were a playmaking organization. And that our chosen audiences are children and families. And they are not a second-class audience to us. They deserve the best playwrights, the best designers, the best directors, and the best actors. And so we recommitted ourselves to that program. We also, for years, I worked at the Alliance Theater Company for years and Virginia Stage Company before going to Child's Play. And when a board member would come up and say, did that play make money? The pat answer was, well, we don't produce plays, we produce seasons. And so it's about the outcome at the end. Well, we actually went back and looked at how how our programs stacked up within each season. And we did some modeling on our business model and came out of it and said, what we want to do is actually look at each project and its resource allocation and its resource acquisition opportunities. Then we went down and we said, what are the resources that we're looking to acquire and allocate? And we identified 7 areas of resources. The normal ones, time, people, and money, but also facilities, tools, partnerships, and reputation. Now, when we got into this, I thought there's got to be a formula. You know, reputation plus people equals money, and that it'll all balance out and everything will be great. And there was no, well, at least to date, we haven't figured out the formula. But when we go into each project, we actually evaluate now the resources that it's going to take to mount a production or undertake a new education curriculum or enter into a partnership and figure out what it's going to take from the institution and what we plan on getting out of it. And we want to give ourselves the time to assess we call it the continuum of generation to distribution. We want time to assess that continuum. So what we want to do is give each project about a 2 or 3 year gestation period before we actually realize it on our stages or in our programs. So, we were working on this shift in our business model. So while we were doing this, we were just spending that cash reserve like crazy. We appropriated half of our endowment to support our facility expenses, much to the chagrin of our auditors. But it goes back to that money was not doing us. It was only $1 million. It was not doing us any good sitting in the bank. So I'm going to jump. What we realized was that we needed to do some fundraising. We needed to rebuild our cash reserves. We needed to fund our fund our programmatic expansion. We had this facility. We paid cash for the restoration of it, so we didn't have any mortgages on this building at all, but we didn't have any money left aside to take care of the roof, to replace the air conditioning system, to make sure that the doorknobs didn't fall off, and all of that sort of thing. So we needed to do some facility stewardship fundraising. We also wanted to do some institutional marketing. Child's Play was the best kept secret in Arizona. We're very, very well known in our industry. Nationally, we could tour nationally and rake in the dough that way, but kind of locally, we were a really great kept secret. And then we needed to rebuild our working capital reserves. And so I've passed out a bit of the case statement in front of you. One of the things, we hired fundraising counsel, and one of the things that fundraising counsel said to us was, which was eye-opening to us, was she said, if you say the word art once in any of these calls, I will knock you out of your chair. Because in Phoenix today, we actually got a letter that said, from a construction firm that said, we're going to turn down your funding request because we've determined that your services are not essential to our community. It actually said that in writing. And so, our fundraising council took that to heart. And so when we decided to put together this fundraising campaign, we called it Creative is Competitive. And the 3 tenets of that was workforce development, economic development, and innovative education reform. And those are the words that kept coming out of our mouth throughout this entire fundraising campaign. And then the other challenge that we had was when we went to we actually went to 2 foundations initially to ask them to provide the initial gifts to the campaign. And they said, this looks like a capital campaign. We'll only give 10% to a capital campaign, and we want to be the last gift in. So those 2 of the major foundations wanted to be the last gift in. And so we decided not to call it a capital campaign. It's really a series of fundraising initiatives. And in fact, one of those foundations then did come in as the lead gift in supporting just a portion of those fundraising initiatives. To date, of the $3.1 million, we have raised 2.2. We're hoping to be done by June, and then we're not done. We're not even close to done, because what we're really doing is just filling of a hole. And then we need to start looking at what we're going to build once that hole is filled. So we know that this is just a stopgap measure for us in a very depressed community, but it seems like we're saying all the right words and everything else is coming out right. So I am finished.
Good afternoon, I'm David Hawkinson. I want to talk a little bit about some messing around with capital we did at Steppenwolf to try to give ourselves some more flexibility and make ourselves a more opportunistic producer. The subtotal of this talk, the subtext of this talk is how to dupe the auditors. Let me do a quick stat on Steppenwolf. Steppenwolf's 37 years old, was started by Gary Sinise in Highland Park, Illinois, some 37 years ago. A couple of years later, it moved into Chicago, really found its roots in the storefront movement, and very much its culture as a storefront movement, even to this day, in many ways in the way we manifest ourselves and how we operate. The focus of the company was to have an artist-controlled company that celebrated ensemble. Today, the company has 3 theaters. It has about $30 to $40 million in commercial real estate. It has a $22 million investment portfolio, operating budget about $15.3 million. But most importantly, it has 46 incredible ensemble members. And for us at Steppenwolf, the challenge is, for my partner David Schmitz and I, is to find the revenue and to find the means to meet all the ambitions of those particular individuals. Because that's what drives our program, that drives our mission, that's what we're about. That's all great and noble until you start getting artists like Tracy Letts or Anna Shapiro or Tina Landau or Carol McCraney, who are at a very particular point in their career and and have bigger ideas. They need a bigger palette than what our limited sustainable capacity is. And not unlike anybody in this room, we face a terrible problem in terms of sustainability and corporate individual support. By accident, the auditors again, about 8 years ago, the auditors said we had to, because of a windfall, that we had to move some $200,000 through the books, either put it in restricted reserves, back into restricted corpus of our endowment. By the way, that $22 million investment portfolio, $12 million of that is endowment. Either we had to put it back into the corpus or we had to release it. If we released it, as you well know, then it goes down to the bottom line and that ugly word surplus comes up and you've lost it. It's gone into the rest of your net assets and everybody now thinks it's part of the establishment. So we worked out a very careful agreement with the auditors that we could do a above-the-line transfer and put the money into a sequestered fund. We called it at that time a quasi-endowment because we didn't really know what we were going to do with that fund or what we were trying to accomplish. That worked for us for 2 years, and over 2 years, by, again, some very specific windfalls that I longingly think about, we got that fund up to about $400,000. Then August Osage County came along, which was an incredible opportunity of ours on a lot of different ways. I went to the board and pointed out that the year that we produced August Osage, we had a $300,000 operating deficit because the show was too big to support with, again, our sustaining support. Now, it's not really true. We actually had a production of Tina Landau's Anne Frank that bust the bank, but there was a much better argument to talk about August Osage. And what? So when I came back to the finance committee after the success and we were starting getting these checks, I said, look, you know, we invested money ahead. We did R&D and we developed this incredible production. If we were sane, we wouldn't have taken on under the circumstances we were in. We've got to figure out a way to have some R&D money. So we made an agreement. We take $450,000 of the quasi-endowment and we match it together with all the revenues coming from August Osage over the next 8 years. And what it has done for us is, you know, first of all, we're just closing a show tomorrow, The Wheel, Tina Landau, 17 characters, with backstage crew of 3 times the normal size, more bells and whistles than you can imagine. We took $150,000 out of that fund to make that production happen. Last year we did Motherfucker with a Hat. It actually had some very specific pneumatic requirements, about $100,000 worth of cost. We took that out of that fund. But at the same time last year, the fund developed about $238,000 in total return because it was a good year in the market. Over the 8 years we've had this fund, We've taken about $2 million of revenue. We've expended $1 million on 4 specific productions over that 8-year period of time. And today we are doing a scope and a scale of work that a theater like ours with a 500-seat theater would never be able to do. It's been a really treasure for us. We never made a commitment to refund the fund. The idea was we just run it out, and when it finally ran out, we'd see if we had a good enough track record to go raise private monies for it, which I do believe eventually we will be able to do within our investment community for our 40-year-olds who love R&D money. That's one issue. The other issue, which was tied to the recession, David and I had gone through a period of time when I came to this theater, we had a very ugly labor altercation. The management won that altercation, and then we went right back and negotiated with employees saying, we're going to clean this thing up, we're going to get better benefits, we're going to get better compensation, we're going to treat you better. As a result of that, we won the Wall Street Journal, one of the best 15, what was it, Dave? 15? One of the best 15 workplaces. Wall Street Journal. That was another opportunity for us, because right after that, we hit the recession. And as our board members were all laying off people, cutting back benefits, we went in and said, look, we worked too hard to get to this point. Look at the recognition. Look at how we've turned this thing around. Look how much that altercation cost us 4 years ago. And bless them, the board supported us. And what our basic proposal was that we'd stop thinking in terms of 12-month cycles, that we should look at our financial performance within 3-year cycles. 12-month cycles, in my opinion, are for auditors. They're not the way we produce theater. They're not the way we plan theater. It's not the way we expend our resources. Now, to be fair, both these things could happen because we had a strong balance sheet. And we also had a strong record of good management and no deficits. But either I'm getting too old and cynical, or I've done this for too many years, but the tyranny of the 12-month cycle just doesn't work for most of us. And it's not smart. It's not smart to focus the board on that kind of results. It's not realistic in terms of the kind of results. You've got to have failures as well as successes. And the question is, can a 3-year cycle, can you still monitor your performance in such a way that your net liabilities are stable and that you are performing well? I think as we are dealing with a lot of changes in our marketplaces, in our funding cycles, and in our artist growth, that we really have to rethink the models that we've been given some 50 years ago about what a well-managed, well-structured organization is. And I think a lot of things that were talked about this morning really hit that. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We're going to have a few minutes now for Q&A before we go to our breakout session. One of the things I want to start with, I have a couple questions for you guys before we open it up to the floor. One, and I'm going to put Erica on the spot here. I have a theory that's not really widely tested, but it's just an observation that when theaters undertake really major capital campaigns for buildings, no matter how well planned they are, no matter how well the numbers have been worked through, that it takes 5 years to sort of rebalance, to get your, sea legs, whatever the expression would be. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I think that's what the transition fund took into account. I would even, maybe posit that 10 years is a good marker, particularly when you went through the kind of growth that we did, essentially tripling our budget. Oh, sorry. Essentially tripling our budget. So absolutely, and that is why it's so key to capitalize that part of the bricks and mortar, because bricks and mortar are tactile, but it's as you've heard from David and Steve, that it's a little harder to raise that other money, and if you can incorporate that into your capital campaign as sustainability, I would, in hindsight, do it for 10 years. No, I would.
Great. I think David is probably the most I think qualified here to talk about another question that I have, which the presentation that we heard earlier today really dealt with kind of national, sort of systemic issues related to capitalization that also can be applied to individual organizations. And when we think about fundraising to improve capitalization, we heard some different stories about particular organizational strategies that are very specific to particular markets. But in the past, there have been some national efforts. One that I think a lot of people are aware of, and I just wrote my column about for the November issue of American Theater, was the National Arts Stabilization Fund. This is where a major foundation or a group of foundations, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation was part of that effort, recognizes a weakness in the field, recognizes the need to strengthen a field financially, and brings significant resources to bear. Can you talk about it? Because I know you were, I think, at Arizona Theater Company when National Arts Stabilization Fund first came online.
No, actually, no, I did put that project together, but I left the state before it started. I was just making a comment to Teresa being the fossil in the room, that it's really important, and it's interesting now that we're all going through these 50 and 60 and 40-year celebrations of our institutional theaters, which don't represent the totality of the work in this country by any means. But if you look at any of those theaters and their history, if it wasn't for the Ford Foundation Cash Reserve Program, they would not be here today. And I can say that about the Guthrie, which I sat through many fire sales on when it was in its 8th year. I can say that of Arizona Theater Company. It wouldn't exist today if Ford hadn't built it. You get to a point which the Florida Theater was talking about, where you go through cycles of rapid growth, and then you're over your head, and you got to be recapitalized. And whether it's the Ford Foundation Cash Reserve Program, whether it's the National Arts Stabilization Program, the old NEA Challenge Grants Program, if you look at the history of the movement, both for orchestras as well as for theaters, but let's just stick with theaters because orchestra is such a sad story. There have been critical moments on most of these institutional lives where they had to be recapitalized. You're not going to recapitalize by creating our budgeting or creating surpluses. As much as I just contradicted everything I said over there, that's not the way it's going to happen. You're going to be recapitalized by being given some tools that can make a difference in your community with your funding community. And that's what we really, in my opinion, that's what we really need to get back in the dialogue now, because we are at a point, as was discussed this morning, we are, again, as a field, badly undercapitalized. In a field, in an environment that's changing faster than it's ever changed for us before, both on the funding side and the marketplace side. We need to be better capitalized, we need help to do that. We can't do it by ourselves, in my opinion.
All right, so we're going to
Is that the answer you wanted?
see if Bob, yeah. Well, Bob Huff's going to have to get those bags of cash to the Eden Theater.
Right.
And then one more question. Steve, you mentioned that you had $1 million endowment that wasn't really doing anything for you sitting there in the bank, I think you said. How did you utilize that? I mean, was it not permanently restricted? Did you have to go back to donors? Was there a big portion that was unrestricted? How did you do that?
The money was not being used. It was, we weren't having much of a return on it at all. And we needed to cover some cash needs. We needed cash to keep operating. And so we turned to our legal counsel, and she did some checking, Arizona revised statutes, to understand how Arizona law treated permanently restricted funds, because this money had been donated to us by a trust that then went out of business. And so it wasn't even around to be able to release its restrictions if we asked. We tracked down one of the trustees and said, you know, we really want restrictions released on this. She said to us, I'm not going to do that. We made a lot of endowment gifts, and if we set a precedence, that would be a very bad thing, but we're not going to come after you, we promise. And so under Arizona revised statutes, our board took action all under the law to release the restrictions on half of that endowment. We left half in place. But our auditors issued a qualified audit because it was not according to GAAP. So we now have a qualified audit regarding the release of those restrictions on those funds. Right now, we're not seeing any kind of kickback from any of our other funders because they saw the need and understood it and saw that our board acted well within Arizona law.
Does anyone?
Could I just make a comment? I think the question about endowment versus working capital is a really interesting one. again, maybe this is my cynicism in old age, but I sort of got to a point with Steppenwolf where I said, why am I putting money aside that's getting a 5% draw, that is not being impactful in the life of our artists today, our audience today, or our craftspeople today? And I think that, especially in this increasingly competitive marketplace we're in, as we talked about earlier, I think it's a question of what's the appropriate use of those assets? And I would argue, well, I love the fact we haven't been down, it's 6% of our revenue. I think we're in a different environment, and I think it's also really hard to raise that money these days.
Absolutely.
I think there are more creative ways of raising that money that can have more impact on your work on stage and more impact on your audience. That's heresy. But.
Questions for our panelists?
I wanted to start with Erica, because you referred throughout your quite fascinating talk about the business model and the changes. What do, for each of you, but particularly for you, Erica, what does the term business model mean? How do you define a business model?
Yeah, go at it.
Well, I mean, in its most crudest sense, it is a line-by-line, budget that is fueled by certain assumptions. So your expenses, and your earned and contributed revenues, and they're flowed out into projections over a period of time. But it's part what you know. It's part what the industry is telling you. It's part what the consultant may be telling you. And it's very particular to you and how you produce theater, how you manage staff, how you manage a facility. So did that answer your question?
I'm not sure.
Oh.
And the reason I say I'm not sure is that I'm part of the strategic planning
Right.
process for a theater right now. And one of the questions that we have been talking about before the study is to revisit our business model. And I'm not sure what that means. I want to know what the component parts are. Do you start with the vision? Do you start with expense and income and expense statement? How do you go about thinking about what constitutes a business model?
Well, Steve, I just want to jump right there. I think I feel very strongly that that it starts with a vision, because without the vision, whether you're producing art or some other product, you have to have a vision. Whether it's a Apple computer, that was a vision, and that I think is always going to be, at least in my opinion, your way in to understanding how you need to fund them and get there.
And I agree with Erica too, that it starts off with the mission and the core values of the company for us, the ensemble, and how we allocate and acquire resources in support of that.
Over here.
Oh, Erica, I want to pick on you again. You got 2 large grants this last year for $25 million and $10 million, and I thought you were going to talk some about that when you talk about your campaign. How did that fit in with the rest of your campaign? How did you deal with the donors on where you wanted to deploy that? That was fabulous that you got it, but can you give us some more background on that?
Sure. The naming of the center is the largest gift that I think you're referring to. Interestingly enough, a small portion of that gift of $25 million was for capital. This was a donor who was very much interested in the ticket initiative, actually, and the sustainability of that program. So in some ways, he was super smart in that, yes, I support, here's some money for the bricks and mortar, but I want you in business, for the next generation, and I want that program in business for the next generation. In fact, we had said, well, we want you to fund it for a decade. He's like, no, I'll do it for 20 years. We're like, okay, great. So that program is, and I will say this out loud, is, this year and the next few years, maybe, 60% funded, but we'll need to fully fund it, and we will go into a, special initiatives funding campaign for that. So that was that gift, and a very, obviously public one. And, you know, yes, our campaign in many ways was an anomaly. It's in New York City, it's on 42nd Street. It was a Frank Gehry designed building. People wanted in on that. But what we convinced them about was not only this sort of, this is not a vanity project. When you give to us, you give for those bricks and mortars, but you're also giving to the sustainability of our institution, and we're getting them to buy into that now. So did that answer your question?
Half of it. How about the other gift?
The 10 million?
10 million.
That was from the Irene Diamond Fund, which has since ended. And that was a long-term relationship with our artistic director, essentially, and that was cultivated over the course of the campaign, which was very short, but nonetheless, it was strict cultivation. I can't give you any magic bullet on that one, you know, silver bullet.
We have to move to a breakout.
Yes? Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, there's lots more to talk about, and we can do that in the breakout sessions.